Hello and welcome back to my shed of sheds. Time to get this thing back on the road. That's the mission for today. I've come in on my bike today, hence a little bit sweaty before I even started. But I want to be driving home in this and driving back again tomorrow. It's a bank holiday weekend, family are away. I've got an opportunity to get lots done. So, gonna crack on. First thing, get these wheels spinning. Now, if you remember on the last episode with this car, before I went and got the new GT, Hero Shark, the love machine, I just, with the help of Chris and his brother, got everything hooked up under the bonnet, got the motor hooked up, got the inverter hooked up, everything was ready to go, but we didn't quite get wheels spinning. So today I've downgraded the firmware on the EV BMW board in the inverter to the last version where manual tuning works. I've got it down to, I think, 4.94. Going to do some manual tuning, try and get the wheels spinning, see what happens there, see what I've done wrong. I'm sure there's something wrong, and have a bit of a play. So that didn't take much in the end. Downgraded to the last version of firmware where manual tuning works. Very quickly realised there was something not quite right with the wiring. Bounced it back and forth on chat with a few friends like Jamie. Tried swapping the phase wires over. Of course, it was the last combination of phase wires that I tried that was the right one. First time I swapped them over, I ended up with it going backwards. Swapped them over again, got it going forwards. And then a little bit of manual tuning, just by sort of creeping up manual ID, very quickly showed that what other people on the forum have found is correct, which is that the sync offset looks to be 0 for this motor. So nice and easy, very little tuning required. As you've seen there, now working in run mode. I had another little issue when I just sort of tidied up the wiring. I didn't get the trigger for my run relay connected, so I had no forward and reverse switch. Couldn't work out why it wasn't working, but that solved that problem. And now we have a drivable car again, almost. Because now that the wheels are spinning, we've got to make sure that all the ancillaries are hooked up and they're all working. Starting with power steering. Almost forgot, before I put the laptop away, I went back to the latest version of the Open Inverter firmware. The manual tuning may not work at the moment, but there are lots of other important upgrades since the version I was testing on, so important to go back to the latest version of the firmware. So down here we've got our power steering pump, nicely mounted. I need some nuts on there actually to make sure it doesn't fall out, so that's an important thing. We also need to mount our breaker. So this is an 80 amp waterproof breaker, which I'm going to mount just about here, just next to the terminal for the connection to the battery pack, and then we can run a nice short connection between there and the battery pack. We'll also terminate our DC to DC converter on that terminal. We need to restore the cover for that as well. We need to 3D print something rather than using a bit of tape to make sure there are no nasty shorts to ground on there. So if you look behind here, you may not be able to see in the dark, but you can see that the big chunky battery connection comes through there, but it very quickly goes off to the side. There's lots of space for a couple of riv nuts maybe to go in there. Could just use tech screws, but it'd be nicer to, what the Americans call tech screws, it'd be nicer to use a couple of riv nuts. So I need to probably take the power steering pump out to drill that, get that breaker mounted, and then hook up the wires. The control wires are already hooked up. Remember, we fitted this plug a few episodes ago to give me access to control wires. So disconnect that, pull it out, and put the breaker in and hook it all up. So it turns out this is actually steel, not plastic like I thought. So I've drilled a hole, cleaned it up, and I might clean up a little bit more actually before I put the, I'm going to use an M5 riv nut. Probably only going to use one actually, I think it's going to be enough. I do need to get some new drill bits. Oh, let me see if I can get this to focus. I do need to get some new drill bits. Need a shopping trip soon because mine are absolutely shockingly blunt. So yes, let's get that riv nut in and get that thing mounted. So there we go, we have power to our power steering pump, positive coming from here, and then earth terminating over here. Right, tidy those wires up at some point, but they're not too bad. Just need to reconnect the signal wires, and then we can test whether that comes on when the car hits run mode. So just a refresher on here, we've got 3 relays on, charge, which really means some power, and run, which means the car's in run mode. So on, these, or this screw is powered up effectively, and we get power to these 4 fuses. So we get inverter power, charger / DC to DC converter power, battery box, and the power steering is enabled but not started. When we hit charge mode, so that is the sort of precursor to run mode, but also the state we want the car in for charging. The cooling system turns on, the DC to DC converter turns on, and the heating is enabled. This relay is only enabled when the main contactor in the battery box, in the high voltage junction box, is closed. So that ensures that the DC to DC converter and heater cannot be enabled while power is only supplied through the pre-charge system, which should avoid me blowing any more pre-charged fuses or relays. And then when the car goes into run mode, that's triggered by the ignition switch, which also starts the inverter. So we'll need a separate signal to start the inverter for charging. We'll need to put a diode in there to make sure it doesn't trigger the run relay. But yeah, when that relay's turned on, then the switch gear is enabled, so we can get forward and reverse. So the car cannot move, in theory at least, when it's in this state. It cannot move. Power assisted steering starts, and the brake booster starts as well, and we'll get onto the brakes in a second. So while I was hooking up the, I've got the battery disconnected for this, while I was hooking up the power line for the charger, I also hooked, power line for the power assisted steering, I also hooked up the main line for the DC to DC converter, and this was all quite neat actually, because I had a couple of short wires, the old wires for the DC connections of the charger / DC to DC converter, which were exactly the right size, both in terms of length, in terms of diameter, and in terms of terminals, to hook up the power assisted steering. So that worked out very neatly indeed. No need to make some new cables. So let's test if that works. Now reconnected the battery, reconnected the signal lines to the power steering. We'll turn the power on and then start. We'll hear, in theory, yep, power steering pump. Not going to run it for long because it needs topping up with fluid and that won't do it any good. But we should, at least in theory, now have power steering, which is good. Next up, let's finish hooking up the DC to DC converter and charger, and then we'll think about brakes. We have both AC and DC lines to hook up for our charger. AC comes in here, and this is the original Outlander charger cable. It's seen better days and it needs ideally a proper grommet on the ends, but I'm generally I've got quite a lot of 3D printing to do to go around and redo grommets on various bits of this car. There's a fairly tight fit into this hole here. So this comes from the rather knackered Type 1 socket at the front of the car, underneath, round and up here, and we'll just secure that with some cable ties and get those terminals screwed in. They're nicely labelled, neutral ground live on there, so that's relatively easy. I've colour coded them as well to make it easy to work out which one's which. And then our DC comes out here. I mean, ideally I'd have this the other way around, but it didn't quite work out like that. So that, you know, the AC was pointing towards the socket and the DC was pointing towards the inverter where it's going to hook up. But you know, can't have everything. And it all our cooling loop works out very neatly like this. Assuming it works, we don't know that the temperatures are going to be suitable yet. So need to run our DC lines. So I've got some 8 gauge wire for this. It's a bit more funky than I thought it was going to be. I just ordered some, I can't remember what 8 gauge is in terms of millimeters squared, but it should be more than sufficient. It's bigger than I think the standard cables that come with the charger for the DC lines are. So we need to put some terminals on to go into there, neutral and positive, and label up which one's which, and run that cable around into here. We're going to just use the terminals in our inverter to hook things up. So we've got a fused line on this side, and we've got an unfused connection into the DC over here. We'll use the unfused connection for the charger, and we'll use the fused connection for the heater. So we'll bring our heater line over here, put some terminals on that, put some, what do I mean? Crimp terminals on that, and get that hooked up and out of the way as well. Maybe. We might just tie that out of the way for now. Right, so crimped up my cables, got my terminals on there, all nicely heat shrinked, which you can't really see. Put some orange tape on the positive side so we know which side's which, and then run them through some conduit under the inverter, back out the other side. I actually left plenty of slack in these wires because I might change my mind about the routing later, so I've left plenty of slack so I can do that. Then through a little grommet again. I'm going to need to do some work just to finish these up, whether it's, it hasn't even been deburred, whether it's, you know, adding some silicone or tightening up the holes, something like that, just to keep everything really protected from water ingress, but it will do for today. So I'll get those passed through there, get that on, and then we can look at the brakes. There we go, charger all wired in, covers back on. Still, like I say, lots of bits of 3D printing to do. You need a cover for the DC to DC converter there. I'm not sure what's happened to that. Need a grommet around the BMS connection, BMS wiring coming out of there. Might put a plug in there actually. Cut these wires off, or rather put a plug on the inside. Put a plug on there and have a waterproof plug coming out alongside those two grommets. That would probably be sensible. Same on the other side. That's rather too small. Need to put something in there, a sort of plastic washer in there so that that fits properly. And obviously some tidying up to do here. You'll also see that I'm not, obviously, if you've been following this, not happy with the wiring here at all. I'm going to completely redo this loom once I've worked out the lengths, locations. I'm going to do a completely fresh loom with probably some sort of bulkhead connector here, going to the inverter, the charger, the high voltage junction box, and then we can have just a nice tidy sort of 3-way connector to keep that engine bay all neat. There'll still be a couple of wires running out of there obviously. So to finish up on the charger then, the only things left to connect are CAN bus, which has historically been an issue, and the, I can't never remember which of the two sense lines or data lines for the charger this one is, but that needs hooking up as well. But we can get to that once we've sorted out brakes. Interesting problem with our brake boosters, or booster. So I've disconnected the power steering for now so that when we go into run mode that doesn't spin up. And what you'll see when I go into run mode is that the brake booster is pulsing. So we've got the, I've changed the way the sensor is hooked up. It was hooked up on normally open, it has to be looked up on normally closed instead. So it's pulsing, and if you hit the brakes, it comes on until it restores vacuum, which is exactly what it should do, but it obviously shouldn't pulse. The reason it's pulsing, I don't know if you can hear this from my microphone, there is a tiny little vacuum leak. So I just need to go through here and sort out that leak, and then brakes will be working properly. Right, much tweaking. I've wrapped this end of the hose barb in both PTFE and then heat shrink to seal up better against the original plastic pipe. That seems to have got rid of any leak, but I was still getting that sort of chugging on and off. So what I've also done is I've taken the sensor off and I've adjusted the vacuum level down a little bit. Still sufficient, I think, but it's not doing the chugging anymore. And now if we put the car in run mode, it doesn't start up straight away, but as soon as we press the pedal, if you can hear that, it recharges the vacuum as soon as I'm using it. May need a little bit more tweaking to get the assistance exactly right, but it seems to be working now, which is cool. So we have brakes, bit of tidying up, and then we can start thinking about CAN bus and maybe getting this thing down on its wheels. Actually, before we do the CAN bus stuff, there's one thing I forgot. I didn't seal the threads on the filler neck with PTFE before I put this together, and we have a fairly significant leak. So this is going to have to come off. I'm going to seal those threads and put it all back together again. I'll be honest, this filler neck is absolute garbage. I shall buy a nicer one at some point. Trying to remove the two threaded bungs, one of them just wedged solid, wouldn't come in, wouldn't come out, wouldn't go further in, and so I couldn't pull it out to wrap it in PTFE. I've put it back in. I've wrapped one side and put it back in because I want to drive this home today and not cycle back. I've stuffed a bit of silicone hose in the top to give me a bit more head. There's today's innuendo. For bleeding the system. It got so dry the pump refused to run for a while. These pumps are very sensitive. They do not like running dry, and so they'll shut themselves down if they don't sense water. So I actually had to, more innuendo, I had to get my mouth around that hose and blow some liquid around the system until the pump kicked in again. And as you can see, it's now pumping away, I think. I mean, I'm assuming that water's actually going round the system. I'll get the lid back on in a minute. And probably put a hose up from there to the radiator. But yeah, we have cooling again. So we have cooling, we have brakes, we have power steering. Obviously need to top that up. Need to put some proper coolant in here ideally, but I can get home on council coolant, on water. And then, yeah, I think we're pretty much ready to drive. We're not ready to charge yet. There'll be some CAN bus mucking around to be done on that front. But yeah, we should be ready to take this thing for a drive. So I'll get things tidied up and then we need to move the cars around and get this thing down off jack stands. Done a fair bit of tidying up. Got a few screws to go in underneath into the bumper. So I'll put my overalls back on in a second. Just thought I ought to check that the DC to DC converter is coming on at the appropriate time. For the CAN bus, I've just stuck my extra long length of wire straight into the charger for now, because that's the only thing I need CAN bus for at the moment. I'll work without a BMS for a few days, well, today at least, and so work out exactly where to put that and how to mount it and stuff. but with CAN bus into the charger, I can at least charge at home, albeit manually still for now. We've still got to add PP detect in order to automatically bring the car on when the charger is plugged in, and sort out CAN bus communication with the BMS in order to bring up charging at the appropriate level. So let's just check that DC to DC converter is working. Didn't think very carefully enough about how I was going to do this with one hand. Gonna wedge that in there. You can see that with the car off, we've got 12.6 volts, so nice healthy battery. And if we bring the car into run mode, and stick this on here, you'll see 14.34 volts. So our DC to DC converter is working nicely. Still got that nasty whine from the pump. Haven't done anything about that this time around. That was part of the plan, but didn't quite manage it. Oh, I've just realised I didn't put any shroud on the phase wires. Maybe you ought to do that as the last thing before I put it all back together. Whew. That was hard work, but it's on the ground and ready to drive. So in order to get out of here, got to get this one out of the way, and ideally put that one where this one is. So time for a bit of shuffling. That's part one done. I wish I hadn't flattened the battery, or one of my batteries, so I could have two cars running and not push one of them. But there we go. Those two side by side. So now this one can come forward, and somehow, yeah, I haven't worked out how that one goes back yet, but we'll work that out in a minute. Second move done. The spider's in the right place, ready for some aesthetic work, sorting out lights and well, lights mainly, panel fit, prepping it for paint so that all those panels can go on that rusty thing over there. Gonna look amazing. Some interior work as well. So last thing, just need to shuffle this one back into the corner. I'd film all this, but I haven't brought my my little GoPro today. I'll get back into the swing of things and bring in all the right stuff soon. That bit was easier because numbnuts here remembered, of course, I do have a spare battery. It was in this one. So battery out of this one into there. It's not the right battery for the car, but it'll do for moving it around. And this one in place for some work. I can even shuffle it back a little bit. And that one ready for a drive, which I think it might be about time for. So that's it. All buttoned up, I think. Done some final checks of the lights, etc. I think the gearbox oil's all right. Only thing now is to test it, and I won't lie, I'm a bit nervous. What if I screwed it up? What if the coupler rips in two? What if, I don't know, any number of things. But there's nothing left for it now. Just have to try it out. Brakes don't feel amazing. Not dire, but not great. What's also immediately obvious is that the acceleration isn't that much better. Well, no. I don't think I've got much brake assistance. Might have to turn around and go and fix that. Right, back in the garage at the front where there's not a lot of light. I suspect it's just the brake booster pumps not doing enough work to give me any brake assistance. So I'm just going to clip it off, adjust that screw, have to put up with the sort of intermittent brake booster. There might be a happy medium, but clearly brakes are more important than low noise. Maybe that we need a reservoir after all, so that may have to be a longer term fix. Right, let's try that again. Just tested the brakes in the garage and here in the drive. Brakes are fine. So let's see if we've got any more power, which I suspect we don't, or at least not much. We might be on to the next phase of the plan to make this thing quicker. I mean, it's hard to tell without some actual numbers. We'll get it out early one morning and do another speed test. Get some 0 to 60 times with the second phone in the car. I suspect there might be a bit more tuning needed. I had a bit of judder earlier when I was turning around, which I never used to get on the other one. So it could be that that sync offset's not entirely right. Right, I'm on the side of the road. Just had the inverter trip out. High res offs error. Can't remember what that is now. I think it represents a few different things. But yeah, going to nurse it home now because I really need a charge. Just nice and easy. Anyway, that's a good place to stop this video, which I imagine is pretty long by now. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. If you want to see, well, continued work on making this thing quick, as well as some work making it beautiful, and the GT project, which will be a lot faster than this one, at least in this guise, then please do like and subscribe, share it around, and drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you think's wrong with the car. Bye bye.